In this Blender tutorial, I'm going to show you how to use the Blender user interface, how to move things around in Blender, how to use Blender for 3D modeling, how to go into edit mode in Blender, object mode in Blender, how to use the sculpt mode in Blender, and then just some different things about the user interface in Blender so your 3D modeling projects work well. When you first fire up Blender, it'll show you this splash screen and it'll ask you if you want to use the left or right mouse button. I recommend leaving it at these default settings and then just click Save New Settings. Then it asks you if you want to start a new file. I'm going to go ahead and click General, and then you're presented with the Blender cube. One of the most difficult things to realize about Blender and many 3D modeling programs is when you try to click on things, sometimes they don't move like you would expect them to do. So I can click with my left mouse button and nothing happens. I can even highlight and marquee and no movement happens. So we'll talk about how to move things with the icons over here on the left. But before you can even move, it's important to be able to navigate 3D space. So there's a couple things that work well for navigating in 3D space in Blender. If I press and hold the middle mouse button, I can orbit around an object. So here I'm holding the middle mouse button. And then if I scroll on the middle mouse button in and out, I can zoom in and zoom out. This is important. And then say I'm zoomed in or zoomed out, and I need to move to the side, so right or left, I can hold Shift and middle mouse button, and I can pan back and forth. All of these commands work with a trackpad as well, but they are much easier to do with a 3-button mouse. So again, middle mouse button in Blender orbits, scroll the wheel, and you go zoom in and out, and then hold Shift and middle mouse button to pan. Now let's talk about how are we going to move this object, because once again, I'm grabbing the object and it doesn't move. Well, over here we have a few icons. So if I click the Move tool, now I get this gizmo that I can move it around. I can grab it on each of the axes. So this is the Z axis, this is the X axis, and this is the Y axis. You might notice these funny little squares. These are great because you can grab it and it moves it in the plane. So this is moving on the Z and X plane. This moves on the XY plane. And you can see that it gives this nice heads-up display when you do that. You can also free move by just grabbing it in the middle. And so this is moving it all over space. In addition to moving, we can click the next tool and it's rotate. And we get a different gizmo. So once again, this is showing the axes that you're going to rotate on. So I can rotate it this way. I could rotate it along this axis, and I can rotate it on the vertical axis. There's one more axis that we can do, and that's the viewport axis. You see this white circle right here. If I rotate that, that'll rotate it along that axis. We have a final tool that we can use, and it's the scale tool. Generally, we're going to want to scale in edit mode rather than object mode. We'll talk about that in a second, but for right now, let's just go ahead and scale in object mode. So here I have these little squares, and I can scale in a single direction, like this. I can still scale in planes, or I could scale the whole thing, like this. So the whole object is able to be scaled, but sometimes reaching with your mouse way over here, then coming back is a little cumbersome. So what we can do is instead use keyboard shortcuts. In Blender, like most software packages, there are tons of keyboard shortcuts. So the keyboard shortcut for move is G. One way to remember this in Blender is to think grab. So if I press G, suddenly I can just move it in space. But that can be hard to use because I'm moving it in space, but then which way am I moving it? So if I press G, then Z, I'm moving it in the Z direction. If I press G, then X, I can move it in the X direction. If I press G, Y, I move it in the Y direction. If I press G Shift Z, then that is the direction it doesn't move in. So I can also move it in the plane. Or if I type G Shift X, I can move it everywhere but the X direction. So this is really helpful. The same works for other tools. So if I press R Z, it rotates in the Z direction. If I press R Y, we rotate in the Y direction. If I just press R, it rotates all kinds of crazy. Scale is the same way. If I press SZ, it's going to scale vertical. S, X, it'll scale that way. Or S, Shift Z, once again, will scale in the XY plane. Let's talk about how to delete a cube and how to get a new object. To delete something, select it, and then press X, delete. We can add many new primitives, so we can press Shift A, go to Mesh, and then add a new cube. By default, it's going to show up right here where the 3D cursor is. We'll talk about the 3D cursor as well, but this is the world origin and the origin of the object and where the 3D cursor is. I can move the 3D cursor around and then different things will move. So if I press Shift S, then I can move the cursor. So I can make the cursor go to selected. So if I do that, it stays right where it is. But if I have G, Y, and then I press Shift S and I move cursor to selected, now my 3D cursor is here. And if I press G, Y, and I move my cube back over this way, then I press Shift A to get a new cube, notice that the cube starts over here where the 3D cursor is. This is very helpful for telling Blender where you want something to happen in 3D space. It's also good for scaling and rotating because you can scale from the 3D cursor. By default, you scale from the cursor, but we can also change that so you can scale from one side of an object. There are many other objects you can make in Blender. If I press Shift A, Mesh, I can make a plane. I can press G, Shift Z and move that plane. I can scale the plane up. I can rotate the plane on the Y direction. So there's many ways that you can add different objects. I can press Shift A again. Mesh, I can add a sphere. I can press G, Shift Z, move that sphere over. I can press Shift A, get a mesh, and I can get a cone. G, Shift Z. And you can get quite far by just using these objects. These primitive shapes, combining them together in Blender can get you pretty far. Let's press Shift A again, and then we're going to go to Mesh, and we'll get a torus. And then it wouldn't be Blender without the monkey. So we'll press Shift A, Mesh, Monkey. This is Suzanne. And then we press G, Shift Z, and then R, Z to rotate. And there is our monkey. But you may notice that the monkey is kind of chunky. There's a couple things to think about here. One is that these are all polygons. So these are the real polygons that we're seeing. Normally, we're going to smooth these polygons when we render so everything looks a little bit smoother. But how can we see that in the viewport? So we're in object mode, and you can tell that by looking in the top left here, object mode. And again, I'll talk about edit mode in just a second. If I right click here and I click shade smooth, suddenly this is shaded smooth. If I right click and shade auto smooth, it gives me a different shading because it's based on angles between the polygons. And then if I click shade flat, this is showing me actually what's there. We're going to talk about how we can subdivide our different objects so that they are smoother. Let's try the same thing on the donut. So if I hold Shift and middle mouse button to pan, right click, shade smooth, notice that this looks much better now. There's no more polygons, it's just shading those smooth. Now watch what happens if I shade the cube smooth. If I go shade smooth, you see how it has this gradient? That's an indication that there's something wrong, meaning there's not enough polygon information to really shade it smooth and to subdivide it. Whenever you see this, that means you probably need to do some more work on your model. I'm going to go ahead and shade this flat again. How would I even work on a polygon model in Blender? How do I move different things around? What is a polygon? Well, first, let's go ahead and look at edit mode. So right now we're in object mode. You can click up here and you can go into edit mode. And it'll go into edit mode of the object that you have. And if you look at the top of the screen here, we have vertices, edges, and faces. You can also press 1, 2, or 3 to go between these. So if I press 1, I have this vertice selected right here. And then if I press G, it will move around just like before. And if I press GZ, it will move up. Now I'm changing the shape of this object. Notice I can't click on the other objects. I have to leave edit mode and then go back in object mode, select a different object and go into edit mode. So let's do that. I can go to object mode, then I can select the monkey, and then I can go to edit mode. Instead of coming up here to the menu, I can just press the tab key and it'll go in and out of edit mode and object mode. This is a keyboard shortcut you're going to use all the time. So I'm going to tab into edit mode. I'm going to click this vertice and then press G. And you can see that when there's more vertices, it changes the object less. You can also select multiple vertices. I can press 2 and then I can select edges. I can also rotate edges. And I can press 3 to move entire faces. When you're modeling, you can move all these edges around and vertices around to create new models. You can also delete faces. So I can press X and I can delete this face and then I can see inside the model. And then if I press 2, I can press F to fill that hole back in. So that's a really nice way to be able to fix your models when they have different holes. I'm going to tab back into object mode because we're not going to cover everything. We're just going to try to cover some of the basic features to get you started modeling in Blender and being able to use it. Another thing that's very helpful is the different views. So if I click here, I can look into a wireframe view. This is a solid view. This is the default view. Then I can look at viewport shading. So this shows the viewport shading and now the lights start to have effect. And then I can do a render preview. So now this is what this would look like in a render. As you can see that there's only one light right here that's affecting the scene. If I press G Shift Z and I move that light over, we can see how it's going to affect the scene. One of the most powerful things about 3D modeling programs like Blender is being able to use lights to move them around and change the scene. I can press Shift D to get another light, and I can put it over here. Even pressing Shift Z to move it in that way. Then I can press G Shift Z, maybe move this light over to the side. So I'm going to go back to the standard shading, but just know that you have this option here. Over here we have all of our meshes, and they're labeled very non-descriptively. So once you start working on complex objects, it's important that you name these different scenes. We have a collection, and then we can also make a new collection. So if I do this, then I have collection 2, then I can label my new stuff. We have object mode that we can enter. And then we can also go into sculpt mode, texture paint, vertex paint. These are other things that we won't cover right now, but I will show you sculpt mode really quick because it's a great feature. So say I select this sphere right here, and then I go into sculpt mode. Now I'm sculpting this sphere. And if I push on it, then I can have different tools affect the shape of the sphere. But right now, there's just not that much geometry, so not much is happening. Up here on the top right, there's this Dino Topo. If I click the dynamic typology thing, then I press OK. Now it's going to create more geometry where needed. This is a wonderful feature in Blender for sculpting. So now if I hold Control, the tool will go in. And then I can build up and I can change the size and the radius. So now I'm going to pull out and then I can push in and sculpt, and it's creating geometry where needed. Some people really like modeling this way. Other people will like modeling polygon way. What's great about Blender is that you can combine both and be able to sculpt, model, and change back very fluidly in between. There's all kinds of different tools over here. I can get the smooth tool. So now I can go ahead and smooth out these shapes. I can move my radius down so it's not going to affect everything as much. And then smooth out those objects right here and just keep sculpting and moving around. So this is a great way to make objects as well. And if I go back to object mode and then I orbit around, and you can see how it's kind of lumpy. This is a time that if I click Shade Smooth, now we can see what's going on with our shape. So very, very great way to make objects in Blender. If you look up at the top of Blender, we have layout, modeling, sculpting, UV editing, texture paint, shading, animation, rendering, compositing, geometry nodes, and scripting. Each of these workspaces changes how everything is laid out in a way that is useful for that workspace. I'm going to click back to the default layout to show a few more things about the user interface, so that way you can get started modeling right away. Over here on the right, we have a few settings. So when you're working on a tool, right here, this will give you the options for that tool. So if I change to the Move tool, it'll give me different options. This is especially important when you're doing things like texture paint. Then we have the render settings, and we have two renderers. There's the Eevee renderer. The Cycles renderer is more accurate because it uses actual ray tracing, but it takes longer. If you do use Cycles and you have a GPU, go ahead and make sure you select GPU compute, so that way when you select the Cycles render engine, you get all that power. There's also the output format, so you can choose what frame range you want, and especially important is this output folder. It defaults to this temporary folder, but most likely you're going to want to select a specific folder for your project. There's also many different render settings and view layer settings. Here we can change the units. So for example, it defaults to metric, but if you want to use different units, you can. You can also change things about the world. For example, right now the surface is the background. We can add a color to the background, and we can go ahead and either click an actual sky texture like this. And then when we see that sky texture in the rendering, we can see that it affects how our render is viewed. And then we can even change the different elevation of the sun. And you can see how the shadows change and the color changes. So I can create very dynamic scenes by just adding a sky background. There's many more things we can do with HDRI textures and different objects. There's object info, so this is important for the information, and you can see as I click on different objects, that information will change. One of the most powerful things in Blender is the modifier stack. So this little wrench adds modifiers. So let's click the monkey so we can see how this works. So if I click Add Modifier, and then what I want to do is click Generate, because they're separated in menus now in Blender 4.0. And then I can click Subdivision Surface. And already the Blender monkey is smoother. And there's two layers here, so I can do two layers in the viewport. And now you'll notice if I right-click Shade Smooth, now the monkey doesn't get all chunky when I shade it smooth. It has a lot more definition. So if I turn this off, you can see the shade smooth, the monkey is kind of chunky, but if I turn it back on, you can see how everything holds its edge. So what it's doing is using the subdivision algorithm to divide all the different polygons. And what's great is this is non-destructive, so I can add different modifiers along the way. And we'll talk about different modifiers as we go along and learn more about 3D modeling. But what's really important to know is that most of the time you can either keep copies of your modifiers or just change them in a non-destructive way. Then there are particles that we can create, as well as rigid body physics. We can simulate cloth, and then take care of materials. Materials is the last thing that I'll cover right now in this introductory to Blender. So if I click this material icon down here, then I can click the different objects, and I can click New, and it'll make a material. Then I can select the base color of that material, and it will change. Notice I don't see anything. That's because I have to at least click Material Preview. And now that I see this orange color there, I can change different things about it. For example, if I want to make the surface of it be more metallic and shiny, I can make it more metallic and shiny. So then when I go to the render, you'll see that this is reflecting off the cube and the different objects that are there. If I want to make it the roughness even less, it'll become even more shiny. So metallic and shiny, you can see how if I make that roughness, this is still metal, but it's very rough. If I bring the roughness down, I get this mirror-like surface. So in 3D modeling programs, the materials and the physical base materials are super important to be able to use. And then you can rotate around and see how that is happening. So then I can click on this object here, click on a new material, change the base color, let's say maybe green. And then you can see how even in the reflection that happens. And then of course, it's always fun to make things shiny when you're starting out. So we can make this shiny monkey. And then there's all kinds of different things we can do with transmission and subsurface scattering and material properties and procedural textures. But that's for later in your 3D modeling journey. Let's talk about the camera. You can see this camera right here, and then we can move that camera to see what's going on. So if I select the camera, then I can select this little arrow up here, then I can view, and this gives me the information about the camera. In the view icon up here, I can go cameras, active camera, or I can just click this camera icon, and it's going to look right through the camera. So what this is showing me is what I'm going to render. And if I click this camera to viewport, now if I move around, I'm moving my camera and composing a scene. So now I can compose this scene, and this will actually render. When you're done moving the camera into position, what you want to do is uncheck camera to viewport. Then I can click render and then render an image. And then Blender will render an image. And when it's done rendering, you can then save that image. So hopefully this has given you an introduction to the basic features of Blender. There's much more to cover. There's animation, there's the grease pencil, many more things. At least now you can orbit, make new meshes, change them in edit mode, add some materials, make a quick render, and then continue to explore in your 3D modeling journey. Happy 3D modeling!